Quadratec Academy, we're going to show you the proper steps to safely and securely install a set of wheel spacers or adapters on your Jeep. Hey, Rob here for Quadratec.com. Welcome to another edition of the Quadratec Academy. Today, we're going to be walking you through the steps on properly and safely installing a set of wheel spacers onto a Jeep Wrangler. Now, you may be installing a set of wheel spacers or adapters for a number of different reasons. You could be installing them to simply push your factory wheels and tires out slightly, giving a more flush look with the edge of your fender flare. Or maybe you've already installed or will be installing a set of larger, wider, oversized tires, and you need to gain some additional clearance behind the tire so that you don't have interference issues with things like your control arms or your springs when you're turning. Or finally, maybe you're installing a wheel adapter to change up your bolt pattern on your Jeep to install a wheel with a different bolt pattern than your Jeep came with from the factory. And when we're talking about bolt patterns, we're going to be working on our 2016 Jeep Wrangler JK Unlimited today that happens to have a 5 on 5 inch bolt pattern. Now, what I mean by that is that our Jeep has 5 lug studs. If we were to draw an imaginary circle around all of these lug studs and measure from one lug stud directly across, the diameter of that circle would be 5 inches. That's where that 5 on 5 number comes from. So we can see we're going to be installing a set of spacers today that are labeled here 5 by 5 to 5 by 5. That means we're not changing the bolt circle, we're simply installing a spacer. As you can see here, today we're going to be installing a set of the Quadratec spacers. Now, these installation steps apply no matter which brand of spacer that you're going to be installing on your Jeep. Now, as I mentioned, you may be installing a set of wheel adapters onto your Jeep, effectively changing the bolt circle of your lug studs. So, for instance, if you have an older Jeep Wrangler TJ or maybe a Cherokee that came from the factory with a 5 on 4.5 inch bolt circle, but you'd like to install some newer 5 on 5 JK style wheels, that adapter will bolt up to your Jeep's hub and then give you that new 5 on 5 bolt circle, allowing you to install your new wheels. Now, you're going to need a few tools to do this job. Of course, you're going to need a set of wheel spacers or adapters for your specific application. You're going to need the set of lug nuts that came with that spacer or adapter to secure them to your Jeep's hub. In our case, the Quadratec spacers include a bottle of red high-strength thread locker. If the spacers or adapters that you're using did not include this, you're going to want to run down to your local auto parts store and pick up some red high-strength thread locker. You're also going to need a torque wrench so that we can properly torque not only the lug nuts on the wheel and tire, but also the lug nuts when we install that spacer, as well as an appropriately sized socket. And finally, this one's optional, but you may need a large breaker bar, and I'll show you where this will come in handy a little bit later on. Now, of course, before we can get started, the first thing we need to go ahead and do is jack up the front of our Wrangler so we can get the factory wheel and tire out of the way. Of course, anytime you're working underneath your Jeep or you're going to be removing wheels and tires, you want to be safe about that. Use wheel chocks, make sure to set your emergency brake, and then lift the vehicle with a floor jack, but never rely fully on that floor jack. Make sure that you're always using a jack stand under the axle. So at this point, we've got our wheel and tire dismounted from our Wrangler, and you may think you're ready to go ahead and begin the installation of your new spacers onto the hub of your Jeep. However, depending on the age of your Wrangler, or whether or not it's ever had a brake job done, you need to inspect it carefully to see if you have these brake rotor or drum retaining clips in place on any of the lug studs. Now, it's important that we remove those before we install our new spacer in place, because if we install it without removing them first, you see, we won't be able to get a flush mounting of our spacer against the brake rotor because of those clips. Now, if we take a look at the back side of the factory wheel, we can see that the factory actually accommodates those clips with these little recesses around each lug pocket. However, If we look at the backside of our spacer, we can see we have a totally flush surface here. We don't have those recessed pockets to accommodate those clips. So you're going to need to remove those first. Now, of course, anytime you're cutting or prying on anything, make sure you wear some safety glasses. And you can remove these in any number of ways. I like to use a flathead screwdriver and a pair of side cutters. It's a pretty easy job to do. Just kind of get in behind them, grab a hold of them, pry them out. And go ahead and remove it just like that. Now that we've got those retaining clips out of the way, we can go ahead and start the install of our spacers or adapters. We give a quick check here. You can see now we can fully install the spacer flush up against the mounting surface of our brake rotor, and that means we're going to have a proper install of our spacers or adapters. But before we can go ahead and install these with the new lug nuts, there is one more thing we need to do, and that's where this red high-strength thread locker comes into play. We're going to need to place this on each of the threads of our lug studs before we install the new lug nuts. Now that's especially important with things like spacers and adapters, because once we install our wheel and tire back on top of the spacer, well, we're going to lose the ability to easily check and inspect the tightness of those lug nuts holding the spacer in place. And if they were to work their way loose over time when we're driving down the road, well, that could cause a very dangerous situation. With a thread locker on each of the studs, now we can go ahead and install the spacer. And then start by loosely installing each of the new lug nuts. Now with each of our lug nuts hand tightened, it's time to go ahead and torque them to spec. Now you'll want to refer to the manual that came with your specific Wrangler or Jeep to ensure that you're using the proper torque specifications. Now in the case of our Jeep Wrangler JK here, the manual recommends a torque spec of 100 foot-pounds. Now it's very important that you do not use an impact gun to torque down the lug nuts on a wheel spacer. There's just too many variables in how tight an impact gun will actually get a lug nut. So you want to ensure that you're using a torque wrench. We can go ahead and set it to the recommended 100 foot-pounds. And then when we're tightening our lug nuts, just like you would do if you were installing a wheel and tire, you want to make sure that you're tightening them in a star pattern, working your way around the wheel spacer or the hub. And that's to ensure we've got an even amount of tension applied to the spacer as we're tightening it down. Now normally when you're tightening the lug nuts on a wheel and tire, you would do that once the tire is set down on the ground, and that would prevent the hub from spinning as you're tightening the lug nuts. However, because we're tightening down lug nuts on a spacer and our axle's up in the air here, well, we have nothing to prevent our hub and brake rotor from spinning on us as we're tightening it. So this is where you're going to need the help of a friend. They can jump into the driver's seat and apply the brakes, and that's going to prevent the rotor from spinning on you while you tighten down each lug nut. Now, if you don't happen to have a friend around that can give you a hand, you can grab yourself a long pry bar or a breaker bar of some sort, and you can simply place this between two of the lug studs, wedged to the ground, and this will prevent our hub from spinning on us while we're tightening our lug nuts down. Now there's one other little tip I like to use when I'm using this method. Because you may need to remove your pry bar and spin the hub a couple times to get complete access to each of the lug pockets, it's easy to get confused at which lug nut you're torquing, and you don't want to forget whether or not you've already torqued or haven't torqued one of the lug nuts. So I like to grab a paint marker or a pen of some sort and just put a little mark next to each lug nut as we tighten it. And that's an easy visual reminder that you've torqued that nut to spec. And now that we've properly torqued each of the 5 lug nuts to the factory torque specification, we know that we've properly and safely installed our wheel spacer to the hub of our Jeep. At this point, we can go ahead and reinstall our wheel and tire combination, hand tighten the original lug nuts, put the Jeep back on the ground, and then tighten those lug nuts again to the same factory torque specifications, following that star pattern again. And of course, all that's really left to do at that point is to complete all those same procedures 3 more times, working your way around the Jeep. Now, the very last part of installing any set of wheel spacers or adapters is to come back after you've put about 50 road miles on the Jeep, remove the wheels and tires, and double check that each of these lug nuts securing your spacers is still torqued to that factory specification. Now, if you guys have any comments or questions about properly installing a set of wheel spacers or adapters onto your Jeep, or if you have any other recommendations for a Quadratec Academy video you'd like to see us make, you can leave those for us in the comments section below. You'll definitely want to hit that subscribe button so you're sure to catch all the latest right here from the Quadratec Academy, as well as much, much more. Until next time, I'm Rob. I'll see you guys out on the trail.